The market at San Miguel was a labyrinth of smells, sounds, and dust. Miguel Santiago had wandered through it countless times, usually in search of old postcards, coins, or small trinkets that carried whispers of the past. But that morning, under the weight of a sun that bleached every colour into a faded shade, his eyes caught something strange. A rolled-up parchment buried beneath a heap of yellowing newspapers. It wasn't much to look at. Its edges frayed, the surface cracked. The vendor, an elderly woman with hands as knotted as the roots of the ceiba tree, noticed his interest. "Old trash," she muttered, waving him away. But when Miguel picked it up, his fingers felt the uneven texture of hand-drawn lines and symbols. Not printed, painted. And the smell. It wasn't paper from the last century. It was older, much older. Miguel was not a trained archaeologist. He had no degree, no title, nothing but an obsession with history born from afternoons spent listening to his grandfather tell stories of forgotten civilizations. He worked at a small bookstore, spent evenings reading about ancient cultures, and spent what little money he had on old maps, even if most turned out to be replicas. But something about this parchment was different. It hummed with a kind of energy he couldn't explain. He unrolled it slowly on a rickety wooden table in the corner of the market. Lines sprawled across the page in deliberate patterns, curving like rivers, but ending abruptly in circular glyphs. Along one edge, faint red ink symbols had been pressed, symbols that didn't match the stylized patterns of tourist forgeries he'd seen 100 times. And at the center was a strange mark, a jagged star surrounded by concentric circles pointing toward a place deep in the jungle. The woman leaned in, her cloudy eyes following his fingers. "Not for sale," she said suddenly. Miguel looked up, startled. "Why? You said it was trash." She hesitated. "Because it belonged to my father. He found it in the hills before he disappeared." Those words hung in the air like dust caught in sunlight. Miguel's heart thudded in his chest. "Disappeared?" he pressed gently. She shrugged, as if dismissing the weight of it. "Happens in the jungle. People go where they shouldn't. The forest takes them." Miguel knew better than to push further, but something told him this was his only chance. He pulled out the bills in his pocket, all of them, and placed them on the table. The woman's gaze lingered on the money, then drifted to the parchment. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like defeat, she slid it toward him. That night, back in his cramped room above the bookstore, Miguel laid the parchment on his desk. The small lamp cast golden light over the faded ink. He traced each line, each curve, with the tip of his finger. The jagged star seemed to pull his attention like a magnet. What city lay there? He cross-referenced old maps and Mayan codices, flipping through dusty books until dawn. Nothing matched. No city was supposed to exist at those coordinates. And yet, the symbols were unmistakably Mayan. The glyph for holy, the one for forbidden, and another he couldn't identify. Something like sleeping stone. He sat back, rubbing his temples. His logical mind told him it was a forgery, a clever mix of known Mayan symbols rearranged to fool the gullible. But deep down, something else whispered, a voice that reminded him of his grandfather's stories, of lands hidden from the greedy eyes of conquerors. Miguel thought of the woman's father, of his disappearance. A shiver crawled up his spine. Was it coincidence or warning? He leaned closer to the map again. There was a faint indentation beneath one glyph, so faint it could only be felt, not seen. Pressing lightly with his fingertip, he realized it was a maker's mark, a subtle spiral that seemed to spin deeper into the paper itself. Miguel didn't know it yet, but that spiral was the first key, and once a key is found, the door it belongs to has a way of calling you. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of a lifetime. 2 days later, Miguel sat in the cramped office of Professor Ernesto Varela, one of the leading experts on Mesoamerican civilizations in the region. The walls were lined with glass cases holding clay figurines, obsidian blades, and fragments of pottery. The air smelled faintly of old books and stronger still of arrogance. Miguel had waited an hour just to be seen. Now, as he unrolled the parchment on the professor's desk, he felt the weight of expectation pressing on him. Varela leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. For a moment, he was silent, his eyes scanning the ink lines and glyphs. Then, a smirk twisted his lips. "Where did you get this?" Miguel hesitated. "From a vendor in San Miguel Market." "She said it belonged to her father." "Her father probably bought it from a street artist," Varela said with a dismissive wave. "This is a forgery. Clever in some ways, but a forgery nonetheless." "It's not in any codex I've seen," Miguel offered carefully. "That's because the forger made it up." Varela chuckled, shaking his head. "Look here, this jagged star. No such glyph exists in authentic Mayan writing, and this," he tapped the red ink symbol along the edge, "is not even in the same style. Amateurs love to mix things. It impresses tourists." The word amateurs landed with the weight of a stone. Miguel's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to point out that Varela hadn't examined the texture of the ink, the pressure marks, the spiral beneath the glyph, but he knew how it would sound. He was not an archaeologist. He had no credentials, no letters after his name, only curiosity and a stubborn sense that this map was more than it seemed. Varela leaned back in his chair, smirking. "You know, there's a reason we spend years studying before making claims. Leave this to the professionals." Miguel rolled the parchment slowly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Maybe you're right. But what if you're wrong?" The professor chuckled again, already turning to the pile of papers on his desk. "Then I will eat my hat, Señor Santiago. Now, if you'll excuse me—" Miguel stepped out of the office into the university's sunlit courtyard, the laughter of students echoing around him. Each laugh felt like it was aimed at him. He clutched the map tighter, feeling its weight not just in his hands, but in his chest. His grandfather's words came back to him. The ones who change history are often the ones history never invited to the table. That night he spread the map on his desk again. He took out a magnifying lens and examined the symbols inch by inch. The spiral mark still caught his eye, but now he noticed something else. Tiny flecks of a mineral embedded in the ink, shimmering faintly under the lamplight. It wasn't just dirt. It was something crystalline. Quartz, maybe. He thought of how the Mayans had used crushed minerals to create certain colors. Could this ink be older than Varela assumed? Miguel decided then and there. He didn't need permission to follow this. He would go himself. But first, he needed to know what those glyphs meant, especially the ones surrounding the jagged star. For hours, he cross-referenced his small library of Mayan translations, sketching each symbol in a notebook. Slowly, a partial translation emerged. Holy, forbidden, sleeping stone, blood path. A chill crept down his spine. It was both a map and a warning. By the time dawn broke, Miguel had a plan forming. He would need to head east, into the dense jungle past the Rio Blanco. It was dangerous, yes, but if the city was real, it would be worth every risk. Somewhere in the darkness between doubt and discovery, Miguel smiled to himself. He wasn't just chasing a map anymore. He was chasing the truth. The rain hammered on the tin roof of Miguel's small apartment, drumming in sync with the restless pounding in his head. He had spent the day tracking down every possible reference to the jagged star glyph, old museum archives, scanned pages of rare codices, even half-forgotten travel diaries of early explorers. Nothing. It was as though the symbol had been deliberately erased from history. But then, just after midnight, a clue emerged. He was studying an 1892 sketch by an obscure British adventurer named Thomas Elridge, who had mapped several Mayan ruins deep in the Yucatan. On one page, between a drawing of temple steps and a serpent carving, was a hastily scrawled note. Ink marks contained powder from the sleeping stone. The priests would only use it to seal holy maps. Miguel leaned back, eyes narrowing. Sleeping stone? The same phrase appeared on his map. And if the ink truly contained crushed mineral, maybe that explained the quartz-like flecks he had seen. But what was the sleeping stone? A legend? A real artifact? The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became. This wasn't just an artistic flourish. This was a signature of authenticity. The next morning, he visited the tiny gem shop 2 streets over, run by an old man named Raoul, who had been a miner in his youth. Miguel spread the parchment carefully under the bright desk lamp. Raoul peered through a jeweler's loupe, his brow furrowing. "This is not modern ink," he said slowly. "The flecks are selenite, very fine, very old. And see here, this ink has been pressed into the fibers, not laid on top. It's strange. Whoever made this knew techniques no one uses today." Miguel felt a rush of vindication. Could it be Mayan? Raoul hesitated. Could be, but if it is, it's unlike anything I've seen. And the mineral, this selenite, comes from a specific cave system far from here, deep in the jungle. Dangerous country. Dangerous country. Miguel's chest tightened, but the words only deepened his resolve. He thanked Raoul, tucked the map into its cloth case, and stepped back into the street. The city was alive with midday noise, vendors calling out, buses honking, children darting between stalls. Yet Miguel felt strangely apart from it all. His mind was already in the jungle, tracing river bends and mountain ridges on the map's faded surface. That night, under the flickering glow of a single bulb, he began planning in earnest. He marked the rivers, estimated distances, noted the symbols that might indicate hazards or sacred sites. The jagged star sat at the center like a challenge, daring him to try. Then he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Under certain angles of light, faint lines connected the star to tiny red dots scattered around the map's edges. These weren't rivers or paths, they were something else. He pulled a reference book from the shelf, flipping to a page on Mayan astronomy. His breath caught. The dots matched the relative positions of certain stars as they appeared over the Yucatan more than 1,000 years ago. The map wasn't just geographical. It was celestial. Miguel felt a shiver run through him. Whoever made this had designed it so only someone who understood both the land and the sky could find the way. It was genius. It was madness. It was exactly the kind of puzzle he lived for. He closed the book, heart pounding. If the experts wanted to laugh, let them. He would follow this map himself. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the night air heavy and damp. Somewhere in the darkness, a single stray dog barked. Miguel took one last look at the jagged star before rolling the map away. Tomorrow he would find a guide. And then the jungle. The morning sky over Merida was heavy with low clouds, the kind that promised rain by afternoon. Miguel stepped out of his apartment with the map tucked safely in a leather cylinder, slung over his shoulder like a soldier's weapon. His first stop was the old cantina on Calle 54, the kind of place where guides, hunters, and men who had seen too much of the jungle came to drink away their memories. The air inside was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of stale beer. Miguel scanned the room until his eyes landed on a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, seated alone at a corner table. His name was Javier Cruz, once a guide for foreign archaeological teams, now mostly retired after a disagreement with a government permit officer. Miguel approached cautiously. "Señor Cruz?" The man looked up, his dark eyes sharp beneath a battered hat. "Who's asking?" "Miguel Santiago. I need someone who knows the jungle east of Rio Blanco." Javier's gaze drifted to the leather cylinder. "You're looking for something?" Miguel hesitated, then unrolled the map just far enough to reveal a few glyphs and the outline of a river bend. Javier's eyes narrowed. "Where did you get this?" "Market in San Miguel," Miguel replied. "I believe it leads to ruins no one has recorded." Javier let out a short, humorless laugh. "And the scholars already told you you're crazy, yes?" Miguel allowed himself a small smile. "Something like that." The older man studied him for a long moment before nodding. "It's dangerous country. Snakes, jaguars, rivers that flood without warning. And worse, men who will kill you for thinking you found something valuable. You sure you want to go?" "I'm sure," Miguel said, surprising himself with how certain his voice sounded. By afternoon they had gathered supplies, machetes, ropes, water purifiers, enough dried food for 2 weeks, and a canvas tent. Javier insisted on carrying a rifle. "For the cats," he said, though Miguel suspected it was more for the kind of danger that walked on 2 legs. 2 days later, they stood at the edge of the jungle. The heat hit Miguel like a wall, and the air was thick with the chorus of unseen insects. They followed a narrow trail along the Rio Blanco, its muddy banks glistening in the sun. As they trekked deeper, the map's guidance became less straightforward. The river bend matched, but beyond that, the paths marked on the parchment didn't align with any visible trails. At one point, they had to wade waist-deep through water, the current tugging at their legs. On the 3rd day, Miguel noticed something strange. One of the glyphs on the map, a spiral within a square, matched a carving on a moss-covered boulder they passed. He stopped, brushing away vines to reveal more symbols. Javier crouched beside him. "These aren't Spanish. And they're not modern either." "They're markers," Miguel said softly. "Someone wanted travelers to follow them." The air felt heavier as they moved on, the forest closing in with towering ceiba trees whose roots coiled like sleeping serpents. Miguel began to feel the city's pull, not in a mystical sense, but in the way the map's symbols seemed to come alive with each step, matching reality more closely. That night, as they sat by a small fire, Miguel studied the parchment again. The jagged star was now less than a day's march ahead, if his calculations were right. But something unsettled him. The red glyph for blood path was directly in their route. "Do you know what this means?" Miguel asked, pointing to it. Javier glanced at the symbol and frowned. "It means something happened there, something worth warning about. You want to keep going, we'll keep going, but be ready for what we find." Miguel nodded, though a knot had formed in his stomach. In the firelight, the map's ink seemed darker, almost as if it was absorbing the flames. The jagged star waited, silent and patient. Tomorrow they would reach it, or whatever lay in its shadow. The jungle swallowed them whole the next morning. The trail, if it could still be called that, vanished within the first hour, replaced by a dense wall of ferns and vines that clung to their legs and snagged at their packs. Every swing of Javier's machete released the sharp scent of crushed greenery, mingling with the heavier, damp smell of the forest floor. Miguel's shirt clung to his back, drenched in sweat. Every few minutes, the map came out of its cylinder so he could compare their surroundings to its faded markings. The terrain matched less and less, but the carved markers, spirals, squares, and occasionally a serpent, appeared at crucial turns, as though guiding them in a language only the map could translate. By midday, they reached the blood path. It wasn't a path at all, but a narrow ravine carved deep into the earth, its sides slick with moss. The name made sense now, not because of ancient blood, but because of the iron-red clay staining the rock. Javier eyed it warily. "Flood channel. If it rains, we're dead in here." Miguel nodded, and they moved quickly, boots squelching in mud. Halfway through, he noticed something on the wall, a shallow carving, half erased by time. A jagged star. His heart raced. "We're close." An hour later, the forest thinned into a clearing, and Miguel froze. Before them rose stone walls unlike any Mayan architecture he'd ever seen. The blocks were massive, fitted with such precision that not even a blade of grass grew between them. Faded reliefs ran across the surface, depicting figures with elongated skulls, their hands raised toward a blazing star overhead. "This isn't on any registry," Miguel whispered. Javier walked slowly along the base of the wall, his hand brushing the carvings. "No, and maybe for good reason." The air here was different, heavier, as if holding its breath. The ground was littered with broken pottery, obsidian shards, and bones, too many bones to be from animals alone. They pushed deeper into the ruin. Massive pillars rose around them, many toppled by centuries of decay. One still stood in the center, supporting a circular platform carved with the same jagged star from the map. At its base, an opening yawned, a tunnel descending into darkness. Miguel knelt, running his fingers over the stone. It was warm. Too warm. Javier's voice was low. "You feel that? This place isn't dead." "Not completely." Miguel looked into the black mouth of the tunnel. The map's last markings ended here. Whatever lay below was the heart of the city, and the reason it had been erased from history. Before they could decide their next move, a voice called out from behind. They turned to see an old man standing at the edge of the clearing, his hair white as bone, his skin lined like ancient bark. He leaned heavily on a carved staff. "You should not be here," he said in a language Miguel barely recognized, but somehow understood. "The city sleeps. Let it sleep." Javier stepped forward. "Who are you?" The man ignored him, his eyes fixed on Miguel. "Maps lead men to treasures, but some treasures are prisons. Leave, or you will not leave at all." The warning hung in the humid air, heavy as the scent of the jungle itself. Miguel's grip tightened on the map. He had come too far to turn back now. The old man's eyes held a depth Miguel could not look away from, like staring into the mouth of a cave and sensing there was no end to it. He stood silently, gripping his carved staff as if rooted to the ground itself. "What do you mean, a prison?" Miguel asked, stepping closer. The man's voice was low, yet every syllable seemed to vibrate in the air. "Long ago, this place was not a city, but a vault. The priests sealed away something they called the sleeping stone. It could heal, or it could destroy. They buried it deep beneath the earth to protect the world from itself." Javier shifted uneasily, his hand resting on the rifle strap. "Old stories," he muttered in Spanish. "Superstition." The man's gaze snapped to him. "I have seen what happens to those who doubt." He tapped the ground with his staff. "Blood has fed this soil more times than you can count. The last ones to come here never left." Miguel's mind raced. The sleeping stone. Was it the same mineral used in the ink? Could it explain the warmth in the stone above the tunnel? The part of him that had spent his life chasing fragments of history was on fire with curiosity. But another part, a quieter, heavier part, felt the cold shadow of the warning settle over him. Still, he had come too far. "I have to see it," Miguel said, his voice steady. The old man studied him for a long moment before turning away. "Then you will need more than courage. The path is alive. It remembers intruders." He disappeared into the trees without another word, leaving the clearing unnervingly silent. Javier broke the stillness. "He's trying to scare us off." "Maybe," Miguel replied, eyes fixed on the tunnel's dark mouth. "Or maybe he's the last guardian of something we're not meant to touch." They descended into the tunnel. The air grew cooler, thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, metallic, almost like blood. Their torches cast long, swaying shadows along the walls, revealing more carvings, figures bowing, hands covering their faces as if shielding themselves from something blinding. After what felt like an hour, they entered a wide chamber. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and upon it rested a smooth, pale crystal the size of a human heart. It pulsed faintly, as though lit from within. Miguel stepped forward, transfixed. He could feel it even from a distance, a hum that wasn't sound, but sensation, like standing too close to a storm. "This is it," he whispered. Javier circled the pedestal, his brow furrowed. "And you think this thing is dangerous?" "I think," Miguel swallowed, "that this is why the map existed, to lead the right person here." He reached out, his fingers trembling. The moment they brushed the crystal's surface, a shock of heat surged up his arm, flooding his chest with light. Images flashed in his mind, cities burning, rivers drying, people kneeling in worship and fear. Miguel staggered back, gasping. His heart pounded like a war drum. Javier grabbed his arm. "What happened?" Miguel stared at the crystal, his voice barely audible. "It's not just a stone. It's alive." From somewhere deep in the tunnels, a low rumble began, stone shifting against stone. The ground trembled beneath their feet. The sleeping stone had woken. The rumble deepened, vibrating through Miguel's bones until it felt like the air itself was trembling. Dust sifted down from the chamber ceiling, and a hairline crack snaked across one of the carved walls. "Time to go," Javier said sharply, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. But Miguel's eyes were still locked on the crystal. It pulsed faster now, the soft glow within brightening as though it were feeding on their presence. He could feel it tugging at him, not physically but inside his mind, calling him closer. "It's showing me things," Miguel murmured. "The rise and fall of cities, knowledge we've lost, things I've never seen before." "Things you're not meant to see," Javier snapped, grabbing his arm. "We need to leave before this whole place collapses." Miguel tore his gaze from the crystal reluctantly. But the moment he stepped back, the glow dimmed. The rumbling slowed, but it didn't stop. It was as if the stone had stirred and was now deciding whether to go back to sleep or wake fully. They turned toward the tunnel, but their way out was no longer clear. A section of the ceiling had fallen, blocking part of the passage. They had to squeeze through a gap barely wide enough for their packs. As they did, Miguel's torchlight swept over a set of fresher carvings, less eroded, almost new. He froze. The figures were different from those on the way in. These ones showed men carrying the crystal, followed by storms, famine, and endless graves. The last carving depicted a single figure sealing the stone inside the pedestal, surrounded by others bowing low. "It wasn't just hidden," Miguel whispered. "It was imprisoned." The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to crawl for several meters before it widened again. They emerged into the clearing just as a thin rain began to fall. The air felt charged, like the moments before lightning strikes. At the edge of the trees, the old man was waiting. His face was grave. "You touched it," he said. It was not a question. Miguel nodded slowly. "What is it? Really?" The man stepped closer, his voice a rasp. "A gift from the sky, given to our ancestors. But gifts from the gods are never free. It feeds on the one who holds it. Power for life, death for greed." Javier glanced at Miguel. "And now?" The old man's eyes darkened. "Now it remembers you." A shiver ran down Miguel's spine. The rain grew heavier, pattering against the stone ruins like distant drums. Somewhere in the jungle, a jaguar roared. Miguel looked back toward the tunnel, a part of him still burning to return, to study, to understand. But another part, the part that had felt the stone's hunger, knew that leaving might be the only way to keep it from waking completely. He tightened the leather strap on the map cylinder. "We leave it," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Some things are better left in the dark." The old man gave a slow nod, but his gaze lingered on Miguel's hands, as if expecting to see them glowing. As they began the trek back through the jungle, Miguel realized that the map had led him exactly where it promised, but it had also led him to a choice. And choices like this were rarely without consequences. Weeks later, the city felt impossibly far away. The jungle's damp heat had been replaced by the dry, warm air of late summer, and Miguel once again walked the streets of Merida with the familiar smell of roasted corn and diesel in the air. To the casual eye, nothing about him had changed, but inside he felt different, altered in ways he couldn't quite name. The map now sat rolled and tied with twine on a high shelf in his apartment, untouched since the day he and Javier returned. He'd thought about destroying it, burning it so no one else could follow, but something stopped him every time. It was history, yes, but also a warning. Javier had taken the payment Miguel had promised and disappeared back to his quiet life on the coast. The old man from the clearing had vanished too. Miguel sometimes wondered if he'd been real at all, or if the jungle itself had conjured him as a guardian. Still, at night, Miguel dreamed. He dreamed of the crystal pulsing in the darkness, its glow spreading like veins of light through the stone walls. He dreamed of the carvings showing famine and fire, of hands reaching for the gift they didn't understand. And most unsettling of all, he dreamed of himself standing before the pedestal again, reaching out. The first week after their return, he'd gone to Professor Varela's office, intending to tell him what he'd found. But when he saw the professor through the glass, laughing with another scholar, something inside him shifted. He realized it didn't matter if Varela believed him. Some truths weren't meant to be paraded for applause. Instead, he found himself in the bookstore one afternoon, speaking quietly to a young student who had been poring over a travel guide to ancient ruins. He told her about the Mayan city of Tikal, about Palenque, about the beauty and complexity of a culture too often reduced to stone pyramids in postcards. He saw in her eyes the same hunger for discovery he'd once carried. And he decided this was the legacy he would share. Not the sleeping stone, not the city that shouldn't exist, but the fire to seek and to question. One evening, he took the map from the shelf and laid it on the table. For hours, he traced its lines, not as a guide to a hidden place, but as a reminder of the path he had walked, from doubt to danger, from discovery to restraint. The jagged star still sat at the center, its ink faded but unbroken. Miguel wondered if anyone else, decades or centuries from now, would see it and feel the same pull he had felt. He folded the map carefully and slid it into a wooden box, locking it with a small brass key. Then he placed the box in the back of his closet, behind old books and forgotten jackets. If it was meant to be found again, it would be. But until then, the city, and whatever slept beneath it, would remain in darkness. As he turned out the light, Miguel thought of the old man's words: power for life, death for greed. In the quiet that followed, he understood the lesson the jungle had given him, that true strength lay not in taking what could be claimed, but in knowing when to walk away. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.